It's our privilege today to have one of Austin's most distinguished citizens, Sarah Weddington, who is with us here in the studio, and who is, of course, known nationally for your work in the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision case, but far more broadly in terms of your service in the state legislature and with the Carter administration. And we're just delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be invited.
And you'll also be interested to know, Sarah, that for the first time in our program's life, we're having a studio audience. And we would like to identify them, those folks who are with us, that we'll have a chance to ask you some questions in terms of anything that we don't cover in our particular dialogue. Would like to begin, though, by identifying you not in terms of your legal status or your public service status of recent years, but where this started. I've read that you were the daughter of a Methodist minister and a public school teacher here in Texas, and where you got your inspiration for public service from those sources.
Well, I've sometimes said I think there are lots of things about being a preacher's kid that are big pluses.
A PK?
A PK. For example, the Methodists move every 4 years. So like good Methodists, we move too. From Abilene to Mundy to Canyon to Vernon, and then I went to college in Abilene, McMurray College. So part of that, I think, really taught me how to meet people more easily and make friends, and that's been a real help to me, especially in politics and public life. Or even the whole atmosphere. My father was certainly someone who preached what I would call the gospel of Christian social concern. And it was a gospel that said you're not just responsible for doing well for yourself, and you're responsible as a member of the community or the state or the nation, the world, about conditions for other people, your brothers and sisters. And so I think it is partly that concern of not just how to make the most money for oneself, but how to make a contribution to the wider community.
Yes.
It still is part of my life.
Well, now, as far as the inspiration from your mother, she was a teacher, and how did that fit into your future?
Well, I think it really came because she was so encouraging of the children. I am the oldest, and so as long as I can remember, she was always very helpful and encouraging in being involved in various leadership activities. I was always in the choir at the church. I did the piano, and she saw that I had piano lessons, saw that I had voice lessons, you know, all those kinds of things, which really have been skills that have been very valuable for me, whether in front of a TV camera or in front of a live audience.
Right. So the sense of presence and communication came as much through her as through your dad.
And then I think, too, just having been raised in the church, people in the church tend to be very kind to the preacher's family. And so when I would do those early things as a very young woman, the members of the church would say, oh, you know, that was so good. And it gave me that sense of confidence that I would go and do it again the next week.
Sure.
And over a period of years, I've really learned a lot.
Well, you know, the kind of confidence that I've read about your generating in future years after your upbringing was putting it in the context of the 60s. And you came to the law school here at UT, and it wasn't necessarily as accepted a thing then for women to be getting into the legal profession, much less taking on a Supreme Court case in your 20s. I mean, it was astounding as someone reads your biography about how you were suddenly propelled into that public role. And did it take you by surprise? I mean, take your breath away kind of thing? Or?
Well, I think if somebody had said to me when I was 21 that I would be the first woman ever elected to the legislature from Travis County, that I would be the youngest woman ever to win a case before the Supreme Court, that I would be one of the first women to hold a major post in the White House, I would not have believed any of it. But it was rather that what I learned to do was take one step.
I see.
And then those steps often led to other things. And I think sometimes in our lives we want too much to know the result. You know, if I do this, what will be the result?
Right,
well, you don't always know that.
Right.
And actually, I started the abortion case not thinking it would be the U.S. Supreme Court case and written about in movies about and books about. I started because a group of women here in Austin said to me, you know, there are a lot of women who are going to Mexico for illegal abortion, and some of them are coming back with real severe medical problems. Can we tell women where the good places are to go? I didn't know, so I had learned in law school and undergraduate that if you don't know, you go to the library and look it up. And my first reaction was to say, I'll go to the library and look it up. And it was that trip to the library that has taken me through 20 years now of work on the effort.
So the extent to which one thing just led to another, and yet you must have had some kind of a vision of having a role or a plan. Did you have that sense of destiny at all as you were?
Not in the Presbyterian sense.
Okay.
But I do think that there was a sense in which John Gardner, writing about leadership, once said that what happens in one's life is according to the intersection of one's talents and the things that are happening in the wider society, the opportunities life gives you. And so I think it was partially that I had a great sense of determination, a great sense of willingness to try things. And it was at a time that, I mean, I think that probably I was elected to the Texas legislature partially because there had been such scandals the year before. And so the citizens of this area were very willing to have women, minority males, others involved.
So it was the intersection of the times and the personality, or that kind of cross-section. And I see you as being caught up in the forces that you couldn't have predicted, and yet you were being propelled forward. And and I would also like to just I think our viewers would want to be updated on what's happened since the one case, because I think that you as a person, I've read somewhere that you didn't want to be known as the abortion lady.
Well, someone once said your tombstone has already been written.
Yeah.
And somehow it's very distressing at 45 to think that my life has already been written, because I would assume I would go on to do bigger and better things.
Okay.
So there is a sense in which I think of myself in a much broader context. Right now, for example, I'm teaching at the University of Texas and doing a class called Leaders in America. And I think young people have had so many people talk to them about business leadership or how much money you can make. I don't think that's the answer to life. And so what I'm trying to do is take students who are currently leaders on the college campus, because I think they are the ones most likely to continue in volunteer political civic leadership, and I'm trying to teach them the best I know. I'm trying to expose them to other people who have chosen those routes of leadership.
When you teach these young folks at the campus, do you talk about your feelings about having been in the Carter administration and that leadership capability and opportunity for you?
Of course.
What's the main thing that comes out of that?
Well, I think out of the White House you say two things. One is that if you look at how you can have the most impact, political service, even for all of its costs, has a tremendous impact. And in the White House, the levers are bigger than anywhere else. And so your sense of what you could accomplish in a day are larger there than any place else. Now, frankly, I think sometimes the cost of political leadership, both on a personal level and in terms of the cost of running for office, has gotten so out of proportion that it worries me about saying to someone you ought to run for office. But some of them in my class are now interns for Republican members of the House, or worked in Democratic campaigns, or independent, or issues. There are lots of different ways to be involved, but I am encouraging them to find the one that fits them and to which they feel compelled to make a role and make a contribution.
Well, I think that you can make a contribution to us here, as we have some people with us in the studio that would like to pose a question to you, or we have one lady at the microphone now. If you'd like to identify yourself and share that thought.
Yes, I'm Jo Smith, a United Methodist. As a district officer in United Methodist Women, I was very glad that our General Conference, as well as the Women's Division of United Methodist, have taken a stand on this very divisive issue of abortion. It has given me some guidelines. In the Methodist Church believes in the sanctity of human life, even unborn human life, and because of this find it difficult to approve abortion. And yet, on the other hand, we also are committed and respect the life and the well-being of the mother. And so if there are devastating circumstances that would affect her life, we as a church say that a legal abortion in those circumstances is all right. On the other hand, as a board member of Churchwomen United, I'm glad that we did not take a position on abortion because of our diverse membership. Just as in Austin Metropolitan Ministries, we respect each person's right to have a different point of view according to their own belief and theology. However, when the Justice Department began pushing for the criminalization of abortion, our Common Council of Churchwomen United met in July, and we have now taken a stand opposing the criminalization of abortion. And that's my question for you, Sarah. I'm wondering how the criminalization of abortion is advancing in the courts. We feel that as Churchwomen United, we have always opposed discrimination in any form, and to criminalize a woman when there are two parties involved seems discrimination to us. Could you tell us where we are in the courts on this particular issue? Before 1973, there were a couple of states, Louisiana was an example, that made the woman a criminal. If she had an abortion, the doctor was a criminal as well. That basically was not ever prosecuted in Texas so much. Today, because of the Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade, abortion is a woman's lawful decision. Now, under the Webster case, the Supreme Court decision this last summer, it says we're probably, as a Supreme Court, going to give the states a lot more leeway to regulate. And so there is one bill that has been proposed in Louisiana to say that a woman would be guilty and would be convicted if she has an illegal abortion and be subject to 1 to 10 years hard labor. Now, I don't think those bills are going to pass. I do not think that the public wants to prosecute a woman in that context. I am hopeful that the other kinds of legislation introduced that would make abortion a criminal offense would also not be passed. I'm much more worried as a practical matter about the kinds of things that would regulate abortion, make it more expensive, more difficult, more time-consuming, and especially on those who have less resources, who are younger, who are less sophisticated. Because I think those women of means and some sophistication about medical services will always have access.
We appreciate that question, Mrs. Smith, and I think that her issue is also raising a thought in my mind as to how much the Webster decision has helped or hurt in the resolution of this most divisive of issues in our society.
Well, I think Webster has made it much more a public issue in the sense that before, whatever debate there was on the abortion issue, everyone said, but the Supreme Court has said there is a right of privacy, and ultimately it's an individual decision. Now, churches could certainly admonish their members, people could certainly admonish those around them, but in the final analysis legally, it was the woman's decision. Webster has not changed that, but it's raised a lot of questions about it. And so in my mind, Webster changed the abortion issue from what I call a perceived into a perceived crisis. People are saying, you know, this is something that if the legislature passes a bill, maybe the court won't declare it unconstitutional. And so we've got to get real serious about the stands of political people. The other thing I think Mrs. Smith really does that's valuable is to point out that there is a diversity of religious opinion, because sometimes through the media we get the impression that, quote, those who are religious are opposed to abortion, and that is just not true. In the Webster case, there were actually more religious groups, many of the Jewish groups, a major part of the United Methodist Church, part of the Presbyterian, some Episcopal diocese, a whole series of groups that said, we as religious communities believe that it should not be a matter for government to decide.
Very clearly, the religious community is not speaking with one voice.
Absolutely not. And I think that's one reason why we need as a nation to be so careful about trying to put into law what, in my belief, is, in the ultimate sense, a religious doctrine.
We need to be careful to recognize that there is someone else at the microphone ready with another question. Yes, please.
Ms. Weddington, I'm Janelle Blair, a local seminary student. In my preparations for the ministry, I am very concerned about how the church, various denominations and congregations have responded to the abortion issue. We have been a very divided church on this, as you have said. And I'm interested in your perspective in the last 10 to 20 years, how the church response, and where do you see it moving in the future?
First, we would have to honestly say that there are some religious groups that have been at the forefront of opposing abortion. The official Catholic Church, I think, would be very dismayed if I didn't mention them, because they have taken such an official and vigilant position on that issue. On the other hand, as I look back, when I was originally involved with abortion, and particularly from a legislative point of view, there were a large number of ministers here in Austin who were members of clergy consultation, which said we will be available to meet with women who are pregnant to look at all the alternatives. I see now more pastors speaking out saying we want you to know our religious persuasion and the reasons for our religious beliefs, and again to look at the diversity. I also think religious groups should be doing more in terms of general social issues, general medical, not just for pregnant women, but I do think that's important. I think if a woman wants to carry the pregnancy to term, it's important for her to have more resources in order to do that, and I think from that doctrine of Christian social concern, we should be speaking more about that. I'm also interested because you as a woman seminary student are not the first, but you're certainly part of the whole trend that has looked again at traditional doctrines about women and said there certainly are wider roles for women in the religious, the political, the legal, in the life of this nation as a whole.
One of the most impressive programs that I've had privilege of witnessing of our own series, as moderated by one of our hosts, was on abortion, and two people on each side, pro-choice, pro-life, and it was one of the persons from the pro-life group that was very interested in one of the services offered by a pro-choice person, and asking very sincerely, you know, do you do other than counsel people to have an abortion? And said, of course. Some women are forced by their husbands or pressure from their parents, and we just try to make the alternatives clear. That openness to what was actually happening in the so-called enemy camp, I thought, was moving. And another person said, you know, one thing is more important in my pro-life view to be accepted. Even more important than that is that the church doesn't split on this, that we don't become, you know, broken apart as brothers and sisters in Christ. And I thought that was a terrific statement. And somehow can we avoid the religious wars of Europe that, you know, in this country where it almost becomes like a crusade against one another?
I don't know the answer to that, because I do think at this point that the abortion issue is basically a religious conflict. No one ever says to me I'm opposed to abortion because I'm a conservative. In fact, Barry Goldwater Sr. has said the true conservative position is it's not the government's business. No one ever says to me I'm opposed to abortion because I think the Constitution makes abortion illegal. Clearly it doesn't. And so what we really get into are people, at least in terms of what they say to me, say my faith is, or I read the Bible in a certain way, or I'm a part of a religious belief. And it is, I do think it is at this point a religious issue. And so it does raise those issues about what is the appropriate role of religion in public life, of the official church, not of religious people. And those are things I think that long-term are going to be more important in a way than how we simply solve the one issue of abortion.
Well, I think that we will be taken maybe a step further in this direction as we recognize another one of our guests. Yes.
I am Juan Jimenez. I am the vicar of the San Francisco de Asís Episcopal Church. And the question I would like to ask you is that issues of human sexuality tend to grab the headlines. But now as we approach the decade of the 90s, how do you see the church carrying out its prophetic voice in other social issues, like homeless, like children who are growing up without having a roof over their heads, the people who are hungry, and many other issues? What do you see that prophetic voice being, and how is it carried out?
Good, thank you.
Well, I think we've begun to see that voice in other countries particularly. While I don't think the church caused revolutions in Eastern Europe, I think the church was often a place that people went for a sense of sustenance, of spiritual growth, of looking at those things that are ultimately more important than day-to-day concerns. If you look at some parts of the world, the church is being very active in looking at those social issues. And so it seems to me that there is an appropriate role here. Again, I think a lot of it, in my personal opinion, is focused on a pastor and those leaders of a church community working with their own congregations about the importance of personal responsibility in contributing to those. The churches do put in a fair amount of money into trying to solve various issues. It's not enough, though. But I think there is a renewed sense of trying to say to people as part of a religious group, as individuals, we have a responsibility to care about those people who are less fortunate, who children growing up, just as you say, without the education they may need, without the clothing, without the housing. Austin, I think, in some ways, it's not a generous community. I don't quite mean to say that, but I do think it's a community that has more a sense of civic responsibility than many others. And it is a sense that we need in the 90s to really emphasize. I frankly think that may happen. I think the 80s were a time that nationally we kind of said, as long as you're having a good time and going to good parties and driving a big car, that's great. And we didn't emphasize the real social concerns and social responsibility as a nation very much. I see us moving away from that monetary emphasis of the 80s. And I do think we're putting more emphasis on family, on human relationships, and on the good of all. I hope that will be a trend that will really accelerate in the 90s. I think it will, and I hope my faith is justified.
Well, we share that. And we are also looking forward to another query that's coming from our studio audience.
My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm an attorney, and I'm also part of the transition generation of women who stayed at home to raise their children and then went back to school. I'd be very interested in hearing your views on serving as a role model for women, and do you think that will continue to be an issue in the 90s?
I do. First, I think that young women today have so many opportunities, and I'm delighted they do. They have so many options. But I do think what we as a society are seeing is that we have not changed the social structures that women need in order to really do the role within the family and the role within professional life that they would like. I was interested in spending time in Nigeria over the holidays because I was very interested in the developing country and the problems there. And what I found was that a lot of women professionally educated do continue their professions, but frankly it's because they have much more help, and help is more affordable than it is here. I think we're going to have to look, like some very important corporate leaders in Dallas have, as making more daycare available. Some corporations are now looking at special care for older parents, the family leave bill pending in Congress that would allow time paid off work without pay, but still off work, for the sickness of a child, illness of a parent, for things related to either birth or adoption. It seems to me that more part-time work, all kinds of things need to be done. But I see young women with wonderful opportunities, with young couples struggling, though, with how best to combine family and paid work outside the home, which for many will always be an economic necessity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Yes, please.
I'm Sarah Burden McClure. I'm the religion editor of the Neighbor section for the Austin American Statesman. And I was curious as to what it is that makes you tick. What is it that leads you to pursue these social issues, abortion and all the various other issues you've tackled? Is there a strong faith behind that leads you in that direction?
Well, I think that someone once said that feeling loved is one of the most important things, and I do feel loved both within my family and within my faith, and I think that is very important. The other part of it, I think, is that basic faith that says our responsibility is to do for others, is to be concerned about the conditions under which other people live. And in the White House, I certainly dealt with all kinds of issues and would certainly hope as my life progresses to have time to be involved in a lot of other issues. So I think it is a sense of saying that what God requires of us is to have faith, but also to be concerned about the well-being of those around us, and I try to reflect that.
Well, I think what you've done in reflecting with us here today is to give us a glimpse beyond what we might call the persona of Sarah Weddington, as the public knows you here and other places in the land and across the world. And we appreciate your disclosing that with us. I wish we had more time, because I understand before the show that you did a show with Dr. Ruth.
I did. She was the last important personality that interviewed me, but you're right on her heels.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll come back on another day and pick it up there. But I think today we need to just recognize that what you represent is a pride of Austin, for sure.
Absolutely.
And I think that for the nation, that you model, it's been raised this question before, that you're a role model, even if people don't agree with your particular point of view. You're straight, and you're obviously a person of great sincerity, and you're generous to have spent this time with us here today.
It's a pleasure to be invited. Thank you.
We invite you to be with us next week on Austin Faith Dialogue. Thank you for joining us. Good day. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7622.